Power creep sucks. Sort of. Let me explain. Players tend to not like power creep, but at the same time, power creep tends to be what keeps the game alive by making money for the game to stay online. Most of the time, at least. First of all, what is power creep? To put it simply, power creep is when the shiny new thing, usually a character, is stronger than the previous thing that was released. At first, this isn't that bad, as every game will have good and bad characters, but the longer a live service game continues, it eventually gets to the point that the newest thing makes the earliest thing obsolete. Sometimes the developers of a game will add patches to buff the older characters to bring them in line with the current level of power. Other times the devs don't and just continue to release stronger characters patch after patch, update after update. Once enough time progresses, if a player is not using the latest characters, they are putting themselves at a major disadvantage. In the case of Wuthering Waves, while the power creep is relatively slow since there are so many damage attributes and each character tends to focus on just a single damage type, power creep still exists. The game is currently in version 3.3 and the characters from version 1.0 to 1.3 have been completely power crept, with the exception of Shorekeeper, but arguments can be made that Mornier does what she does but better since she also buffs Toonbreak, Lahai Roy's signature mechanic. Now, this is not saying that Wuthering Waves has not buffed the older characters. The 1.S characters were buffed at the launch of version 2.0 with the introduction of Nightmare Echoes. However, while the Nightmare Echoes were definitely a buff, it was more of an indirect and minor buff. The older characters also got buffed indirectly with the new support characters, like Yuno buffing Jiyan and Linne buffing pretty much everyone. In Kuro Games' previous title, Punishing Grey Raven, there is a feature called the Leap system, which allows players to buff older characters who aren't as powerful as they once were due to power creep. These changes even give the characters new animations, making it very clear that the character was leaped. And the best part is that it is completely free, with the materials needed being rewards from the weekly tasks. So, with the Leap system in mind, I thought it would be fun to brainstorm some hypothetical buffs to the 1.S characters of Wuthering Waves. Also, since there hasn't been a rerun of 1.S characters in quite a few patches, it would also be a convenient time to buff the older characters while also giving them a rerun. Before we begin, a few things to note. 1. I will be keeping the core identity of the characters intact. By this, I mean that a sub-DPS or support character won't suddenly become a main DPS and vice versa. In addition, a character's main damage attribute will also remain the same, such as Jiyan being a heavy damage dealer and Xiangli being a resonant skill damage dealer. 2. I will only be talking about the characters that I own and therefore have extensive knowledge about. This means that I will not be talking about Xiangli Yao nor Zhezhi as I do not own either of these characters. As such, I do not know enough about their playstyles to know what makes them good or bad. To call for changes for these two characters without knowing much about them would be in bad faith, and I would just be talking out of my ass. 3. I will be avoiding the simple make number bigger route for these buffs as much as possible. I realize that in order to make these characters better, the numbers that they deal will have to increase, but keeping with the style of the game, I will focus on specific damage attributes when talking about these buffs. Now, with all that being said, let's start with the first limited 5-star character of the game, Jiyan. Jiyan is an arrow-heavy attack main DPS character. His core gameplay loop is focused around his liberation, Xingluang mode. Did I pronounce that right? I'm just gonna call it QLM so that I don't butcher it any further. While in QLM, Jiyan deals consistent heavy attack damage for 10 seconds. If he has at least 30 points of resolve, or half of his forte meter, he has a different animation when entering QLM, which also deals a chunk of damage called Emerald Storm Finale. Once his liberation ends, he simply exits QLM and usually has enough of his concerto meter for his outro skill. My idea to buff Jiyan comes in 3 parts. 1. Using Emerald Storm Finale increases Jiyan's heavy attack damage by 2% every 0.5 seconds, stacking for a total of 10 times for 20% and lasts for 15 seconds total. 2. If his Retina skill is used during QLM, he gains 30 extra Resolve. Resolve cannot exceed the default amount of 60. And number 3, when exiting QLM after using ESF, Jiyan initiates a final attack with the same damage multipliers as ESF. We can call it something like Emerald Storm Finale, Electric Boogaloo, or something. By doing this makes using his Liberation with at least half meter matter more, as it will be a significant DPS loss to not do so. This also will reward players for going through their rotation and managing their Retina skill timing properly. The Retina skill Restoring Resolve is an idea taken from Havoc Rover. When Havoc Rover is in his one-winged angel state, his meter continuously depletes over time. However, by using his skill, Rover recovers a bit of meter, letting him stay in his enhanced state a little longer. Granted, it's not a whole 5 seconds like with the proposed buff for Jiyan, but Jiyan is a limited character and this is for his ultimate, so I gave him a little more leeway. Emerald Storm Finale, Electric Boogaloo, is there just because the ending of his ultimate ends with no fanfare. If we look at the more recent characters with a transformative liberation, like Zani, Cardithea, and Hiyuki, they all have a final attack with the liberation, so I figured I would give Jiyan the same courtesy. The second character on this list is Yinlin, who is an Electro sub-DPS character focused on dealing coordinated damage. Her core gameplay loop is focused on dealing damage when she is not the active character. When she has a full 14 meter, she gets a new heavy attack called Chameleon Cipher, which deals electro damage in a large area and inflicts enemies with punishment mark. Every time the active character inflicts damage on the enemy inflicted with PM, Yinlin will also deal a bit of damage to that enemy. On paper, this is fine. However, when Yinlin uses Chameleon Cipher, she is forced into an animation for nearly 2 seconds. 2 seconds may not sound like a long time, but in a combat game where every second counts, especially in a game as fast-paced as Wuthering Waves, even a single second is a long time. What's worse is that Yinlin is completely vulnerable throughout this entire animation. This causes her to take unnecessary damage, sometimes making her get knocked out of the animation and in turn, not inflict punishment mark, which is her core gameplay mechanic. So here are my ideas for Yinlin. Either give her drastically increased resistance to interruption and defense during Chameleon Cipher, or take an idea from Carlotta's enhanced heavy attack, Imminent Oblivion. When Carlotta uses Imminent Oblivion, she is immune to all damage and even freezes the enemy in place during the animation. If Yinlin got even one of these things, either the invulnerability or freezing enemies in place, this would make her gameplay a lot smoother, as you would not have to worry about getting knocked out of her CC animation and wasting her entire rotation. The second buff for her is to her coordinated damage hits from Judgment Strike. I'm going to lean further into her role as a sub-DPS and support for this buff. Instead of each hit from JS simply dealing damage, my idea is to have it either lower the target's defense or electro resistance. Each tick of JS can reduce the defense or electro resistance by 2%, stacking 10 times for a total of 20%, lasting for 20 seconds. Reducing electro resistance will make her more of an electro-focused support, while reducing defense will make her a better generalist support character. Alternatively, since coordinated damage is basically damage over time if you think about it, each hit of JS can inflict a stack of Electro Flare, making her a dot character. Heading into version 1.1, we have Jinhsi, a Spectral main DPS character with a focus on resonant skill damage. Her core mechanic is to build her meter by having her teammates deal damage, then using her enhanced resonant skill to summon the Sentinel of Jinzhou, Jue, to deal damage. In my opinion, Jinhsi can be buffed greatly if she just got a dedicated support character. As of now, there is not a single character in the game that buffs both spectral damage and resonant skill damage with their outro. But since this is not talking about potential characters, here are my changes to her. I'm going to be taking a few creative liberties here for her buffs. Jinhsi is the resonator for the Sentinel Jue, who has the ability to manipulate time. She's also one of 3 confirmed characters that achieved a second awakening, which if the game had character rarities past 5 stars, this would make Jinhsi a 6-star character. So with the fact that she achieved a second awakening, plus her Sentinel having the ability to manipulate time, let's put that into her gameplay. When her Resonance Liberation hits a target, that target is frozen in time for 5 seconds. After those 5 seconds are over, the target is no longer in stasis but is still affected by the time dilation and has their movement speed slowed by 50% for 3 seconds. All damage taken within this time frame will be stored in 2 separate instances of damage before popping, with a damage multiplier of 1.5 during the time freeze and 1.25 during the time dilation. So, if you manage to do 1000 damage for both instances, instead of doing a cumulative 2000 damage, you'll do 1500 damage for the first tick and 1250 for the second tick, for a total of 2750 damage. This basically takes the freeze effect from Spectral Rover's outro skill and a portion of Cantarella's Hazy Dream effect for the flow with an additional damage multiplier. While 8 seconds of enemy crowd control seems a little overpowered, I thought it fitting as lore-wise, Jinhsi is probably one of the most powerful characters in the game. And while the damage multiplier seems overtuned, the next character to swap in is most likely going to be either a support or sub-DPS character like Shorekeeper or Yinlin. So the higher damage multipliers won't actually do that much damage. That being said, if players use Jinhsi's Liberation first, then her rotation to use her enhanced skill for the giant nuke, the total damage numbers will still be less than the current DPS ceiling. With the Magistrate of Jinzhou done, let's talk about her counselor, Xiangli. Xiangli is a fusion main DPS and just like Jinhsi, is focused on resonant skill damage. Her combat loop is focused around gaining stats of True Sight to use her enhanced heavy attack, Flaming Sacrifice, then using her ultimate, and then immediately using Flaming Sacrifice once more. At the time of her release, she was one of 2 characters that could consistently stay in the air and attack, the other being Jinhsi. It's not as much of a novelty now as so many characters have mid-air combos, but I figured that I would focus on her being a mid-air attacker. So my buffs for Xiangli are as follows. 1. Her resonant skill damage is increased by 1.5% every 0.5 seconds she is off the ground, stacking 10 times for a total of 15%. The stacks reset back to 0 if she is not in the air for 3 consecutive seconds. Using either True Sight Charge or Flaming Sacrifice will reset the timer back to full. 2. Using Flaming Sacrifice will reduce the target's fusion resistance by 7.5%, stacking up to 2 times for a total of 15%, lasting for 20 seconds. This is focused heavily around Xiangli staying airborne as long as possible, and lets a Monofire team, which is arguably her best team, really shine with the 15% fusion shred. Keeping the stacking buff will not be difficult either. You can either use her skill or her heavy attack to go into the air, or use Flaming Sacrifice to keep a consistent uptime. Or just jump. That works too. Alternatively, since we already have a mono fusion team buffer in Lupa, we can stick to Xiangli being focused purely on dealing damage with the negative status Fusion Burst. Every time True Sight Charge hits a target, it will inflict 5 stacks of Fusion Burst. Using Flaming Sacrifice will inflict 10 stacks of Fusion Burst immediately. The damage from Fusion Burst will be considered resonant skill damage. With this, not only does Fusion Burst actually have a use in the game instead of just being something that Inferno Rider can do to us, it also helps Xiangli's damage by quite a bit. A regular rotation of her kit has her using 2 TSCs, then a Flaming Sacrifice, her ult, and then Flaming Sacrifice once more. So not only will she be proccing Fusion Burst twice, she'll also deal a substantial amount of damage with her own rotation. This also indirectly helps Amith as she now has a teammate who can inflict Fusion Burst, allowing her to use her other Resonance mode instead of just Tune Rupture. Entering the final patch of version 1.x, we have version 1.3 and Shorekeeper. Shorekeeper, I honestly can't think of anything to add or change about her kit that would be new. She's already a top tier support and she does a lot. She heals your team in both chunks and over time. She gives your entire team an attack buff and a crit rate buff, and she immediately heals your active character back up to full health if they take a fatal blow once every 10 minutes. The only thing that I would change about her would be to extend the duration of her ultimate a little longer. The initial duration of 30 seconds was pretty generous back then since the rotations of characters were pretty quick. Most characters would pop in, use their skill and then their ultimate alongside a few basic attacks, and then swap out. However, nowadays characters are staying on field for longer and longer to go through their rotation, and 30 seconds is a pretty tight window for some team setups. I often miss the timing of swapping back to Shorekeeper for her unique intro skill by just 1 or 2 seconds. If the duration of her ultimate was longer by like 5 seconds, it would help out a lot. But then again, I guess that's what her S1 is for. So I suppose that I would just make her S1 a part of her default kit. Or maybe I just need to learn the team rotations better. The final limited 5-star character of 1.x is Camellya, and she is a Havoc main DPS with a focus on basic attack damage. Her core mechanic is to fill up her forte meter and then just hold down that attack button to spin to win. At least she used to. Now her damage has fallen off greatly with the amount of HP bloat enemies have gotten. She has 2 different modes, her regular mode and her blossom mode, or her white-haired form and her red-haired form. When in her normal state, her spin to win attack spins vertically and has a higher damage multiplier, and is primarily meant for single target DPS. Her Blossom mode spin to win is horizontal with a lower damage multiplier and is primarily meant for clearing groups of enemies with its large AoE. Due to the incredibly simple nature of her core gameplay, I had a lot of trouble thinking of a buff for her that wasn't just increasing her damage multiplier values. Not to mention that her signature weapon, Red Spring, already increases both her attack stat by 12% and basic attack damage by 10%, stacking up to 3 times and then a further 40% after using her giant nuke attack. Her forte passives also increase her basic attack damage and havoc damage by 15% each, so I honestly couldn't think of anything else to buff that wasn't already getting increased by her default kit. However, not every buff to a character needs to be a direct attack increase. And after looking back at Jiyan and Jinhsi, I finally thought of 2 changes that I was satisfied with. The first change was to her giant nuke attack, Ephemeral. At the time, and even going into most of version 2.x, this was one of the hardest hitting attacks in the game, thanks to its damage multiplier of 1265%, which was only increased by her 2 passive that increased both her basic attack damage and havoc damage by 15% each. This isn't even including her support teammates Sanhua, who buffs basic attack damage by 38%, and Rochia, who buffs havoc damage and basic attack damage by 20% and 25% respectively. However, a single attack does not a good character make. So my change to Ephemeral is this. Targets hit by Ephemeral, should they survive, will have their havoc resistance reduced by 15% for 5 seconds. 5 seconds is just long enough for Camellya to go through an entire spin to win cycle one more time before outroing, and her outro is where I have my second change. Upon using her outro, Camellya will summon her vines to entangle enemies, dealing periodic damage over time while also reducing their movement speed by 50% for 5 seconds. She has a bunch of barbed vines at her beck and call. I fell into a thorn rosebush as a kid, and that hurt. Getting untangled from that was even more painful and took a lot of time, so her vines should do something similar. So those are my changes to the 1.S characters. Some of these changes are obviously going to be more substantial compared to the others. But that's to be expected since I came up with most of these in the span of like 2 hours. Feel free to let me know what you guys think, and if you have any changes or buffs of your own that you thought of, feel free to leave a comment of what that is. That being said, thank you for watching, and until we meet again in the boundless sea of stars.
I can see the dawn on water's face, with the shimmering light that starts to rain.